Okinawa, where the Japanese went crazy.
Want to come up, bud? You come up, look out the window.
Oh, my injury. Oh, that's for everybody at home. Okinawa, 1945. The final island conquest by American forces in the Pacific War offered a horrific demonstration of Japanese suicide attacks. Kamikaze aircraft targeted American ships, and Japanese civilians killed themselves in a panic provoked by their own soldiers. The rate of casualties suffered at Okinawa on both sides encouraged the Americans to use the atomic bomb instead of assaulting mainland Japan. Although by the beginning of 1945 it was inevitable that Japan would be defeated by the Western Allies, it was feared that Japan's reluctance to admit defeat could make the war last for many more years. Despite setbacks in the Pacific theater, Japan still held on to much of Southeast Asia and China. It had executed a successful campaign in 1944. It was even considered that the Japanese leadership might evacuate their own islands and continue the war from bases in Korea, Manchuria, and China. Well, we did the rape in Nanking, so you know that the Japanese invasion of Manchuria was the official beginning of World War II. Not many people know that. It started and ended with the Japanese. And they're scared that they're going to pull out and go to Korea and China and fight from there. It'll be a pain in the ass. Advancing across the Pacific Ocean from the east in their island hopping campaign, the Americans reached Iwo Jima in March 1945. Their next target was the Ryukyu Islands, halfway between Formosa and Kyushu, and the southernmost island of Japan. The largest island in this group was Okinawa. It would make an excellent air base from which to strike Japan with more devastating air raids, and it would provide a launching site for an invasion of Japan itself. Now, just an anecdotal bit about Okinawa. Okinawa is not Japan, because I know that karate was brought from, an old karate guy told me that karate was brought from Okinawa to mainland Japan. Genshin Funakoshi or something. Anyway, so Japan must have, I don't know, taken it over. They took everything else over. The Americans called it Operation Iceberg, and Admiral Nimitz's Fifth Fleet was at the core of it, transporting some 180,000 troops of the U.S. 10th Army. The American carrier force was joined by Britain's own, with 4 aircraft carriers and 1 battleship. Despite naval supremacy, the Americans remained fearful of continued Japanese aerial assaults. Both Formosa and Kyushu were still in enemy hands, and the Japanese were committed increasingly to kamikaze or divine wind attacks, in which tremendous damage could be caused to American ships by pilots crashing their explosives-laden planes into them on suicide missions. Okinawa itself was defended by 130,000 Japanese soldiers, and the native population were terrified into committing desperate acts, believing it was better to commit suicide than yield to the American invasion. The American operation began with airstrikes against air bases on Kyushu and Formosa in an attempt to neutralize the aerial threat to the invasion fleet. Waves of kamikaze then responded by attacking the major U.S. carriers, so badly damaging the USS Franklin that she had to be towed away. The British steel-decked carriers survived the attacks better than the wooden-decked U.S. carriers. American air power, though, managed to halt the Japanese assaults, and the U.S. Navy prepared to attack Okinawa. A pre-invasion barrage was initiated by the escort ships. The capture of the island of Kurama provided a secure anchorage for the invasion fleet. On the island, they discovered a chilling variant on the kamikaze: 350 suicide boats packed with explosives, all destined for use against the invasion fleet. Their capture removed a major threat from the Allied ships. The landings began on the 1st of April with a decoy assault force diverting the attention of the defending Japanese on the southeast coast, while the actual invasion fleet of landing craft surged towards beaches on the western coast of Higuchi with 60,000 troops. The landing itself was unopposed because the Japanese planned to defend their island further inland. As the Americans built up their beachhead, the Japanese sent some 355 kamikaze aircraft. Private Townsend of the 2nd U.S. Marines describes the impact of these attacks. The plane's engines ripped through the landing ship and exploded in the Amtrak compartment, killing and wounding the sleeping Marines in the Amtraks. I'll never forget that day or the kamikaze days that followed. My landing ship had at least 2 or 3 near misses during the attacks. I truly believe that there is nothing more terrifying than having a man hell-bent on committing suicide guiding his winged bomber at you. I had been through the Banzai attacks, but we were able to control those. We had no control over the divine wind. The U.S. fleet lost 2 destroyers and a few other minor ships to the kamikaze assault, but struck back by attacking the Yamato, the largest battleship built thus far, eventually sinking it after 4 hours of aerial bombing, along with 4 destroyers and a cruiser. This action put an end to the Japanese Navy. The Yamato must have been bigger than the Bismarck. The Japanese, the Yamato class, they had a Yamato class carrier, but they're talking about a battleship. And they had huge ships. As the Americans advanced further inland, they hit the Machinado line. An awesome series of interconnecting fortified emplacements dug into the rock. Clearing out position after position made for tough and exhausting fighting, and heavy rains did nothing to help American morale. U.S. Marines took the brunt of the action. They fought on 2 fronts by advancing to the north of the island and to the south. The Machinado line was eventually pierced on the 24th of April, but then a further bloody assault had to be undertaken against Shuri Castle, which had a maze of tunnels beneath it. This was eventually taken on the 28th of April with flanking attacks, and on the 21st of June, resistance in the south was finally crushed. On the 27th of May, the island's capital was captured. All the time, the Americans had to face almost constant kamikaze attacks, some 3,000 suicide sorties in all, which exhausted Japanese air strength but also accounted for a total of 21 American ships. Japanese losses in the battle were staggeringly high, reflecting the increasingly suicidal nature of their defenses. At least 107,500 were killed, with a possible 20,000 more buried alive in caves by American soldiers who preferred to seal up the defenders rather than risk their own lives by trying to capture them. Some 4,000 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The U.S. 10th Army lost 7,374 men killed and 32,056 wounded, while the U.S. Navy lost 5,000 men killed and 4,600 wounded. It had been a costly victory, and the Japanese had virtually annihilated their own air force in the process. U.S. aerial bombardment of Japan intensified, inflicting huge destruction on Japanese industry and the civilian population. Okinawa demonstrated how desperately the Japanese would defend their homeland, and the American experience of this, along with other strategic concerns, helped them to decide on the use of atomic bombs to end the war. They reasoned that the huge losses expected from a land invasion of Japan would dwarf those inflicted by atomic bombs. It would certainly come at a high cost in American lives in addition to those of Japanese soldiers and civilians. Thus, it was that the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August finally ended the war in the Pacific without the need of an Okinawa-style invasion of Japan. Man, I've seen some footage of that stuff, and the Japanese were going crazy. They went insane and were killing themselves. The civilians were killing themselves and jumping off cliffs. Kamikaze shit going on to where it's like, we're just going to drop the bombs, man. This isn't feasible. It's like, I don't know, man. I was thinking we should drop the bombs instead of doing the invasion. It's like, yeah, man. I'm thinking this is the Pentagon. I'm thinking the same thing too, man. Like, I'm general. And that's how it happened, children. Remember that never underestimate the suicidality of Imperial Japanese. all the times I've been asked, are you having any thoughts today about hurting yourself or anyone else? I think of them, the Imperial Japanese Air Force. And then I go, nah, not today. I'm still drinking coffee. It's like 1 p.m.